Hey guys, today I'm going to show you all how to install the Holley 8-channel injector driver. So I use these on 16 injector setups. My personal car's got 16 Holley 220 pound-per-hour injectors, and they're all sequential. So I'm going to show you how to put one of these in here and how to program it, how to wire it, the whole 9 yards. So this is the box. It's light. This is my hand. It's pretty small. My hand's not small. The box is small though. So it comes with all the wiring you need. So there's 17 wires here, and 8 of them come from the ECU to tell this when to fire, and the other 8 go out to your injectors. So power is not sent from this box. We're just triggering it with a ground, just like your standard first 8 injectors in your harness. So you supply power to your injectors from another source. You use a relay to turn them on, just like you do through the standard Holley harness. This is the power plug for it. This one's already been cut down because it's going to be fit to a car, but it comes a lot longer. It does not need to be fused, according to Holley. There's no actual load on this thing, so all it is powering the driver module itself. It's not actually powering the injectors. So you've got spare terminals, and I'll show you how to insert those. Actually, I'll show you that quick now. In order to insert these, this is the plug. It's just like the ECU plugs, right? But what you do is, you see these little white tabs. This is the locked position, right? So the larger of the 2 tabs on this side, depress it. If you have a fingernail, it helps. You just push it in, and now you can actually remove the wire or insert it. So if we wanted to put a wire in, just slide it in, right? Slide it in until it's all the way to the bottom, and press your lock tab. If you don't get it all the way in, all right, so like say you only get, halfway in, you think you got it all the way in, it won't lock. So you see the lock tab stuck, which means it won't insert into the injector driver or the ECU. So these connectors are the same connectors on the ECU and the injector driver module. So anyway, the first thing that I always do is mount whatever device I'm going to be putting in a car, so you can get an idea how long something has to be. But I've already got one of these mounted in the car, and you run power and ground, and then you what I typically do is run from the ECU to the injector driver module. So the book that nobody ever reads, it's really nice, it's laminated, all 9 yards, tells you all about the LEDs. If you look in the back here, it gives you a pinout, but I'm going to show you how to do 8 sequential injectors out of the ECU, out of a Dominator, and go from there. So I'm going to move on over here to the computer. We're going to do some screen capture, and I'll show you what you're looking at in the pin map and what you have to run one wire from the next. So give me a sec. All right, so let's get into how to actually install this. So the first thing that I typically do is get on the laptop, open up the global folder that you're working with, and hit your system ICF, and it'll pop up engine parameters. You typically would have, one set of injectors here. So if you're adding a second set, or if this is a new project, you're going to set this to 2 sets of injectors, and your injection type is going to be custom instead of multi-port. So hit custom, and then you're going to come over here and hit configure injector sets. So we're working with set 1, okay? Number of injectors 8. Then your system type, you're going to pick your injector. So there's a whole bunch of injectors in here. All right, so the system type for this application is Holley 220, and I'm running them at 75 pounds of base pressure. and the firing strategy is sequential. So this is a 16 volt system with an alternator. I'm going to set these to 8.2. You want to use this first set of injectors for prime shot and for cranking fuel. So if you want to, and for individual cylinder correction. So if you want to use both sets of injectors for your prime shot and your cranking fuel, you can. In the past, I've done 2 sets of injectors. You know, like the first set might be a 700 or 850, 850 pound per hour, and then the second set might be like 160s or something to drive around on. So if you don't want to use your big injectors for cranking fuel and prime shot, you know, just configure them accordingly. So whatever set 1 is, you can set to do prime percentage and cranking percentage. And you can do the same thing with set 2. So we'll go into set 2 here. But we only got 1 set. So let's go back to configure set 2. Now it defaults to 160 pound per hour Holley. So number of injectors 8, firing strategy sequential, and system type, I have 2 sets of 220s, so that's what we're going to put in here. Notice it changes your rated flow per injector because of our higher injector pressure, or our higher fuel pressure at the injector. So this injector actually kind of turns into a 290 pound per hour injector. And again, like I was saying, you can use for prime shot or for cranking fuel and for individual cylinder correction for your second set of injectors here. If if that's what you choose to do. If you wanted to do that, you'll have to go back to set 1 and change this from 100% to 50% because we can't exceed 100%. So we change those to 50, go in here, change these to 50. And now each set of injectors will be responsible for half of the prime shot and half of the cranking fuel. So by doing this, what we've done is we've actually changed the pin map. So we'll go to pin map and let's view outputs. So when you go to view outputs, these are generated, okay? So injector M through T is cylinder 1 through 8. The old way of doing 16 injectors with a dominator and no additional box was you'd have your second set of 8 would be in batch fire, and they would be here. So they'd be on your J2 connector, but right here, as you see, they're not in use, okay? Because we're going to be doing 8 of them sequentially. So we go to view outputs. What I like to do is write down on a piece of paper, B12 is cylinder 1, B6 is cylinder 2, B8 cylinder 3, and then we compare that to the instructions on the injector driver. So this is the injector driver. This is the kit. So it comes with the wire, like what I just showed you, the wires from the ECU to the injector driver, and then the wires from the injector driver out to the injector themselves. The standard injector connector, and the connector for the injector driver module, power harness, and then some additional pins for both this connector and this connector. So this is, everything that it comes with. And if you click down here, this is something that seems to get overlooked a lot, but Holley's got instructions for everything, right? So they put the instructions here. It's pretty odd, but if you click on that, it'll populate this window, and you have detailed instructions, which also comes in paper form, in the box, like what I just showed you. So before we look at the injector driver's basic functions and how to choose the dip switch setup, we're going to skip over this for right now, and we're going to go to the wiring aspect of it, okay? So this is the 34-pin connector from, on the injector driver module. So if you notice, pin 27 is injector 1 input. So what we're going to do is, on our piece of paper where we just wrote B12, so J2 B12 is injector 1 output from ECU, is going to go to pin 27 on the connector for the injector driver module, so on and so forth. So this is the input on here, right? So this is the input into the injector driver module, which is an output from the ECU, okay? So we're in view outputs, and this is the output from the ECU, and it goes to an input into the injector driver module. So there's 8 in, and then there's 8 out. So what I like to do is, you know, we mount it in the car, we figure out however long the wiring's got to be, cut to fit, and then and we crimp some terminals in there, or if it's the length that comes, you know, pre-canned from Holley, you can plug and play. But again, I can't stress this enough, out of ECU into injector driver, okay? So these instructions have got some diagrams. Now, these diagrams, you need to pay attention if you're going to use these diagrams. Notice this diagram says J1B, okay? This is your standard main harness. This isn't adding the second set of injectors. This is using this box to drive a first set of injectors, okay? So pay attention to this because the pinout, you know, is different. So if you were driving, you know, whatever type of injector you wanted, and you didn't want to just use the standard drivers that are built into the ECU, this would be the diagram that you would use. There's another diagram here that shows J2B. And I believe these instructions were done before V5 was released because they don't have a diagram showing you how to do full sequential. Hence the reason for this video, because I get a lot of questions about how to do this. So we're going to ignore these diagrams. We are going to use this right here. This is the pinout for the 34-pin connector that is on the injector driver module. So let me go make some wires, and we'll start plugging them in, and I'll... All right, so we have made our harness to go from the Dominator ECU here into the injector driver module, and it's cut the length. The ends are all terminated, and here's what I was saying before. This is typically what I do. I write up, you know, this is the location from J2B, so B12 is injector 1, the wire color is gray, injector 1, and it's going into A27 on the injector box. So I do this just because when you're in the car, I like to have everything written down anyway. So there's a couple wires in here that we didn't talk about before. We need switched ignition power, so we need to actually turn this box on. So all the load is carried through the large connector, but it still needs to turn on. I use an output from the Dominator to turn the injector driver box on, and I just configure a 12 volt out above 8 volts just so it turns on when the ECU turns on. And then there's 2 fault wires, which I'll explain when we do the setup on those. But one is just a ground fault, so you can put an indicator on the dash if you have a fault with the injector driver box. And then the other one is a code, so it sends 0 to 5 volt code, or, you know, signal out to the ECU, and then inside of the manual it'll tell you what, you know, what voltage equals what error. And then one last thing that I didn't talk about is this little white jumper. So if we look in the manual on that same page we were just looking at, right? And and I'll go back over this when we do some screen capture. But if we look at this, there's your 12 volt switched 11, and then you've got a high side drive configuration or a low side drive configuration, and then you have to input it here. So all Holley EFI, we're switching it with ground, like I stated before, so we're going to do the low drive configuration. So you jump the wire from 8 to 30. They give you the little jumper wire, and there it is, 8 to 30. So now what we're going to do is we're going to pop some wires in here into this connector so we can populate the connector. I'll do one, and then I'll turn the camera off, and you don't need to watch me put them all in here, but we'll start with injector 1. which is gray. It's coming from B12 on our sheet, right? And it's going into the injector box at A27. So when you read these, if you look at the back side of them, it's going to be hard to see on the camera here, but if you've got one of these in your hand, you'll see it. They're imprinted with some numbers, right? So bottom row, the first one here is 26, and then the next one next to it is 27. So take the wire, insert it, right? And notice our lock tabs are open, right? So the lock tabs are up and go all the way in. You can look in from the top side, kind of hard to see in the camera, but you'll see the terminal all the way up to the top. And if you want, you can check every single one you do by pressing the lock tab and make sure it actually locks. So it will not lock if it's not all the way in. So I'll go through, populate the rest of the connector, and plug it all in, and then I'll show you some setup for the ground the ground fault output and the 0 to 5 volt output, and what you do is we'll do the same for the injectors going out onto the engine. So be right back. All right, so we've made our harness to go from the ECU to the injector driver box, and now we're about to set up some of the things that I just touched on. So the first thing that I had shown y'all is I use a output to turn this on, the switched power. And then the other two are the faults. So these are the instructions off of Holley's website. They also come, they also come with in paper form when you buy one of these things. And there's some faults that can be seen and actually data logged, so that you can go back and look. So we're going to go over the output that I set up to turn this thing on, and the fault outputs and the fault code outputs. So there's a bunch of different voltages for each type of fault, right? And then you'll have this fault output is basically, look at this as like a light, just like they said, right? A fault light. I'm going to wind up outputting this internally to the dash, so a light will come on the dash if there's a fault. And then, so just so you know, if you're driving down the road, if you've got an issue or something. So the first thing, let's look at the software. This is our pin map. Let's go. Here's the outputs, right? So injector driver power is what I named it, 12 volt. This is where I pinned it, J2B24. And I just configured it to the output will activate when the battery is above 10 volts. So once the ECU sees power, it's going to activate this. Once the ECU sees 10 volts, it's going to activate this. Hopefully you've watched some of my other videos and you know that 10 volts is no good. So we want more. So it's simple, easy way to turn it on. No more, having to splice into your steering column and whatever to get switched ignition power. Then we've got some inputs. So I've got a bunch of them here, so give me a second, we got to find them. Here we go. Injector fault, it's a ground input, there's nothing to configure. Okay, that's where we pinned it to, J2A20. And then we've got injector fault, 5 volt. This is the one that we have to actually program. So we make this a 5 volt injector fault input. We go to configure. So this is a custom 5 volt. All right, so we make this a custom 5 volt. And remember, there is a total of 9 faults, right? So, and those are your voltages. So what you do is you take these voltages, plug them into the calibration table, right? So half a volt, 1, 1.5, all the way up to 4.5. 4.5 is number 9. Okay? It's very simple to scale it, and then I run 5 volt for the rest of the table because it will, where are we at? It'll output, there you go. Fault pulse pairs will be separated by a 5 volt pulse marker, so you'll see it come on and then off if you had more than one fault. So that's how you set up the output so that you can data log if you've had any issues with the injector driver module. And again, you just pin map it to the corresponding, right here, 5-volt injector fault, and then ground input injector fault. So that's all there is to that. And for outputs, again, injector driver power turns on over 10 volts. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to program this. So actually, before I jump to that, I showed you this earlier, but low drive configuration, remember this, pin 8 jumps over to pin 30. So if you're using Holley EFI, that's how you do it, low drive configuration. And now we're going to go to how you actually program this thing to follow the current that you're looking for, right? So this is the dip switch configuration. It explains that you have to hold the push button next to the dip switch for 10 seconds. And these are the different options, right? So they come with a little library here of, a couple common injectors of what configuration you should be using. So we're going to physically go do this, and I'll show you on the camera. Give me a minute, we'll be right back. All right, so here we go. We got our injector driver module. I've already unbolted it here, but here's the back side of it with the cover off. You've got 4 dip switches, just like it's illustrated in the documentation that comes with it, and then that little red button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to power this up. Don't mind the car, it's a little bit of a mess. There we go. All right, so you see 2, 3. So that green button, or that green light is flashing 3 times to let you know what configuration is loaded in this. So what you would do is you move the dip switches to whatever configuration you need, and then you hold the button. So I'm not going to change the configuration, but I'm going to hold the button. It's 10 seconds. All right, so now your configuration is stored, and you're ready to rock and roll. All you got to do is pin out your injectors like I showed earlier, coming out of the connector from here and out to the engine. So I'm not going to cover that with this car because it's a little bit more involved. It's got to go through a bulkhead connector and whatnot. But again, this does not send power out to your injectors. It's only the switched ground, the pulsed ground to activate them. So you'll need to power it from a relay, and it's kind of hard to see, but I use a smart wire to do that, but it's all kind of hidden in there, so I'm not going to go cut that open to show you how to hook up a power wire, but 18 gauge is supplied with it. So run an 18 gauge to each injector, join them together to a 12 or a 14 gauge per 4. If you're using big injectors, typically what I do is 16 gauge. I run a 16 gauge wire to each injector and then join them all to a 12 gauge or a 10 gauge. So it all tells you that right there in the manual. So follow the instructions, and hopefully this was helpful for you. See it.